morning, everybody, from a sunny Galway, and I hope the sun is shining down wherever in the country or even further afield you are. Delighted to be here as part of the second of this four-part mini-series that Ireland Together have put together with a host of expert panels from within the community to help us all not only just to plan for our reopening of our businesses and our workplaces, but also to ensure that we can remain open and to make sure that we are all operating as safely as possible. So just by way of introduction, so Blaithnaid is Head of Employment and Corporation and Corporate Immigration at Leman. Solicitors, she's got over 10 years experience advising Irish and international clients on all aspects of employment law. She is trained and qualified as one of the leading employees and trade union firms in the country. She then went on to spend 4 years working in one of the leading top 5 law firms in Ireland, where she predominantly advised employers. She advised on also aspects of employment, the employment relationship from recruitment right through to terminating the employment relationship. Her experience includes general advice on working time structures, internships, internal investigations, grievance, disciplinary procedures, as well as the preparation and review of employment contracts. So Blaithnaid is also co-founder of the Leman's new HR business called HR Legal, which provides consistent and commercially practical on-demand HR advice to employers. Phew, Blaithnaid, that is a huge, big introduction. So looking forward to hearing from you in a minute. And then after the presentations, we will hear from Lesa Brady, who is in Management Global. She has an impressive 20-year proven track record in bookkeeping and payroll management at senior level with qualifications to match. Lesa is one of the very few people in Ireland to be fully certified as a QuickBooks Pro advisor. She is self-trained in advanced payroll techniques and currently a member of the Irish Payroll Association. Lesa is a keen advocate when it comes to educating and empowering clients in understanding the financial side of their business, and in affiliation with local partnerships, she mentors startup businesses in areas such as bookkeeping, payroll, and personal taxation. So Lesa is going to be joining us. And just a little bit on me, my name is Mary Finn, and I work based in Galway, but in case of have car, have Teams, have Zoom, will travel anywhere. And my company is called Connect for Work, where I work with organizations to put in place retention strategies to support their employees to either remain in work and avoid an absence or return to work if an absence has occurred.
Great. Okay. So as Mary, so basically my talk today is very much from a legal perspective, and it's about just sort of compliance and the legal watch outs of what we need to sort of think about in terms of returning to work. So I'm not only going to be talking about, there's been a lot of changes in the employment law world, some COVID related, some not COVID related. There's been a lot of changes that have come in. And then there's even more changes that are anticipated. Now, I've tried to cover the main points today. I'm sure I will have missed some. For example, I haven't talked much about the extension of parental leave, parents' leave, and whatnot. But if you do have a question on that or anything at the end, happy to answer where I can, or indeed if I can answer the question today, I'll certainly come back to you. So as I said, so that's the focus of today. So the first thing I wanted to talk today about is this right to disconnect. You'll have all heard about it. This new code of practice came in April of last year. And it's obviously a very new premise. And I suppose the main ethos about it is to put perimeters around hours that we work and to sort of help bring in that level of disconnect, because what we've all found, largely obviously for people that are working from home, that the lines have become very blurred now from when you start and when you finished. We often would have answered the email when we went into the office, maybe in the evening, but that line has become even more blurred. And then as well with people's own personal circumstances, if they have family or anything at home, sometimes it's just easier for them to send emails at night rather than, when your colleague might be working. So this is what the idea of where this whole right to disconnect has come in. And sometimes, particularly with more junior people, if their manager sends them an email at 10 o'clock at night, they might feel a bit pressurized that they have to respond to it. So that's the whole sort of premise behind all of this. Now, what I would say is there's no one size fits all. There's a number of template policies that I've seen sort of knocking around out there. And it's, they need to be tailored very much to the specifics of your business and how you work. You don't have to, I had a client one day, he asked me, is it that I can never send an email after 5 o'clock? And it's not that rigid, but you do need to think about it and how your workplace works. For example, in our workplace, what we say is, there's no need to send an email after 7 o'clock unless it's urgent. Of course, if you're working on something that's urgent, that's fine. And, you work with your manager on that. But, it's all about getting into the discipline of that and sort of learning, how to sort of manage that. So you have to put this policy in place now, and technically it becomes part of your employment contract. Now, I wouldn't say you need to issue a new employment contract for this. It could be just issued to employees saying, this forms part of your contract, and it's nearly like an addendum. And all it is going to be, these sort of rules. And it needs to emphasize as well that, people aren't going to be penalized as well if they don't respond to an email. It gives that sort of comfort to people. But it also emphasizes that the obligations is on the employee and the employer. It's all well and good an employer sort of setting this out, but the employee has got to reciprocate it. So don't be sending an email to your colleague expecting that they have to, respond to that. So it's just about sort of managing that. There is no repercussions for not having this policy in place. I should say that, but they have said if you don't have it in place, inferences can be drawn. The way I would see this coming up is probably in a bullying or harassment type claim, where somebody was saying that their manager is harassing them or sending them, hundreds and hundreds of emails late at night. If you had this policy around this or whatever, that would help to show, that you had rules around that. So, it's a very, very new process policy. So we'll have to see how it's going to work out and how the WRC is going to implement it. But it is important for employers to start thinking about this and putting it in place. So then the next one is hybrid working. Some of us are probably doing it already. Some of us are just solely working from home. But certainly as the world starts to open up now, hybrid working is going to be a real hot topic. I think you'll probably be the exception, subject to the type of work that you do. But if it's office-based, to going back to that 5 days a week. And if you are adopting that 5 days a week, if you are adopting not going back to 5 days a week, then there's a lot of things to think about and how you want to do that. There's new legislation expected to come in Q3 of this year. There was a consultation process ran there by the Taoiseach about hybrid working and how that might work. So they're currently gathering all that information, and we're hoping that there's going to be legislation will come in as part of Q3. Interestingly, a lot of us will already have adopted some sort of hybrid approach to going back into the workplace. So it'll be interesting to see how much that differs to what we're actually doing on a practical basis. But I suppose, the points you need to sort of think about is, when you're looking at this, look at your workforce, look at the work that you do, look at the demands of each employee and decide, how can this be done? And, there's certainly people, in an office that need to be in the office all the time. And then there's certainly people that can sort of, work partly from home and partly in the office. Even think of, people that are training. It obviously makes more sense for them to be in the office because that's how you get the more sort of on the job type training. So you do need to sort of look at each role and how each person or each role adapts to the idea of, being in the office compared to working from home. Because you will have a choice then, and that's the point that we have to remember. And you also have to balance that with, the sort of the health and safety risk of all of this. And, is that person, for example, a vulnerable person, and it can get quite complicated. So, and how it gets complicated, I suppose, is when you have that employee and like we saw from the coming out of the last couple of lockdowns, and I've no doubt we're going to get even more of it, is, that employee who says, no, I'm not going back to work. How do you manage that? And to be honest, a lot of what I've seen over the last year is just, it's anxiety. It's the fact that they've been at home for a long time. They've got a bit sort of scared to sort of go back in. They don't really know what to expect. So educate your staff, explain to them what measures you put in place. Refer to the return to work protocol. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail in my next slide. But explain the measures that they put in place. And if an employee says, for example, I don't know, what's the rules on face masks, explain to them what you're doing there and reassure them. And more often than not, that does get you over the line, but you'll obviously have some people that have in their head and they're just saying, no, I'm not coming back. I'm outright not going in. And that gets more problematic. I mean, if there's a reason for that, for example, if they're a vulnerable person, and if they refuse to get the vaccine, which again is another minefield, then my recommendation there would be, it's about getting a medical opinion. Don't take that on yourself as an employer, because you could sort of open yourself up to, a potential discrimination angle on that. Because we're not doctors, we don't know what the answers are to these. So, if they say it's any sort of medical reason, seek advice, work with that OC Health in order to find a solution. But, and if you go down that road, and it turns out that, that person can come back into the workplace and you need that person in the office because of their specific role, then you're maybe looking into, like, can you redeploy that person? Can you adjust the role? And that's, the sort of reasonable accommodation piece, which, I know Mary's going to talk about a bit later, but it's those sort of factors that we have to consider. Now, what I would say to you is we can't just automatically terminate someone just because they refuse to return to work. So if we're going down that road, be very, very careful on that. You really need to show that you've sort of covered all angles, really considered it. And I'm not saying that you can't ultimately dismiss someone if you get to that point, but I would look at it as sort of the last resort and see if there's a way that they can be worked around. It might be just that they're sort of saying to you, can I stay at home for another 2 months? I'm due to get the vaccine, just sort of bide with me. And, in that circumstance, unless there is some very strong business reason that you need them in the office, my recommendation is that you probably should work with them, because you probably would be sort of exposing yourself potentially, to a claim in the WRC for unfair dismissal, or indeed something on the Employment Equality Act, if they could say that they had a recognised disability as one of the grounds on the Discrimination Act. So as I said, the termination is a last resort, but it's not impossible. But I always have clients come to me after they sort of reacted rather than thinking before they react. So just think about it, look at all the options, get OC Health in if you need to, and sort of consider it on that basis. So next of all, we have just earlier this month, we had the Return to Work Safety Protocol. It's been updated. That first came in place last year, around May of last year. They updated again in December, and then it's been updated again. It keeps getting updated as we learn more about COVID-19, as there's more sort of in-depth, information provided. And then again, we can inform our staff, and I must stress that, and I'm sure you've all done this already because we had this bit last year, but, as part of your return to work, be mindful of the protocol. It is actually quite useful, it does have sort of helpful guidelines. But if you ever get an inspection by the WRC or indeed the Health and Safety Authority, one of the first things they'll want to see is, where's your response plan in terms of the return to work protocol. They'll want to see how you've worked alongside this and put a plan in place. So I'm not going to go into the detail of the return to work safety protocol because I could be here all day, but the main things that have come in with the new updates, they've put more information in terms of face masks, particularly in production, with types of factories where they're saying people should work in pods and always use face masks, clean the face mask where possible, how to dispose of it, things like that. There's also a lot of information on ventilation. And, it's not necessarily saying that, employers need to go and invest in, a very complex ventilation system. It's reminding people, open a window, make sure there's fresh air coming in and out. Obviously, if there's ventilation there, that should be used, but it just explains how important that is, in an office space, in a factory, in anything, to just make sure that the air is clean. I'm sure you can all remember a day when you worked in the office and one person got the cold, and then within the week we all had the cold, and it's just to sort of, think about that. Obviously in Ireland, it doesn't necessarily work all the time that we need to keep windows open because we're not in a very warm country, but look, it's just something to be mindful of. They also talk a lot about the antigen tests and the vaccines. So I'm going to talk about that separately, but it is quite useful in terms of the level of detail. It shows now that they're actually thinking about this, and it has given a bit of clarification of this complete minefield. And then it goes into a bit more detail as well about employee obligations. For example, to remind employees that, your job doesn't stop at 5 o'clock on a Friday, for example. Like, remember, when you're out and about, that like you could be going back into a work environment, and about that's how COVID could be spread. So, everybody's obligations in terms of, maintaining a safe place of work doesn't stop, it continues. So again, what I would say here is, educate your staff. There's no harm doing a refresher when you're coming, when you're sort of planning your return to work, to just get people to keep thinking about it. I mean, some people would just be like, I'm so sick of listening about social distancing. I'm so sick of this. And it doesn't have to be anything very detailed, but, a 10-minute sort of, quick Teams call, Zoom call, with people, just to be like, look, these are the top things you need to remember about, and remember that responsibility keeps continuing. You're not only looking after yourself and your family, but your colleagues. So it's useful that they've put that in, because it just shows the importance of this, and it's not just part of the day job. And then lastly, in line of all of this, if you're implementing any more measures, you need to go. Hopefully you will have created a risk assessment as part of this. So just to update your risk assessment, to show that you've looked at the workplace, people need to wear face masks, perhaps because they're sitting closer together, we've put better ventilation in, there's doors are left open, just things like that to show what you've thought about. And you use the return to work protocol as sort of like a checklist in terms of updating your risk assessment for your COVID response. So vaccine and antigen tests, the minefield that exists. So obviously, antigen tests, this is something that's become quite topical. My own view is I'm not sure how beneficial the antigen tests are, but that's my own personal view. I feel like it can be a bit of a red herring, and my concern is that, obviously, whilst, it's useful in terms of showing, if you have the antibodies, my concern would be that people will get a bit too comfortable, and they'll sort of, they'll not keep mindful of the need for the safety measures to keep continuing. But as I said, the return to work protocol has done a lot of work on this. And the big piece, what I would say is, if you're going to bring in antigen tests, you need to consult with your staff. You can't just bring in the tests and then roll with it. You've got to consult with the staff and sort of figure out, are you happy with this? Are you not happy with this? And you will have people that won't want to do them, and they need to be safeguarded, right? And then you will have people that do want to do them. So then you've got to look at that group, and then you need to think about as well, should you do your own internal testing? Should you do external testing? Now, there's a lot of detail in the protocol about the types of antigen tests that are recommended and legit and all of that. Now, I understand there's lots of companies out there that will do testing for you. And to be honest, it's probably more from a cost perspective and, availability of people to do those tests. But they're just things that you need to think about, like what works best for the organization. And, as well, as I said, consider those that don't want to do the antigen test. They should be safeguarded. And you need to sort of consider how frequent you're going to do this type of testing, and is it really necessary to your business? Are you really in a high risk organization that you need to know this? So then the vaccines. So the vaccines is the minefield. It's, it's nobody really knows what way to do it. And I think we're very much sort of, learning as we go. But again, the protocol, emphasizes consult, right? And, you would consult here, by the way, with your lead representative, your health and safety person, with management, and sort of think, right, what are we going to do here about the vaccine? Like, what is the risk in terms of our workforce? Can we keep working from home? Like, how much information can we really ask about people that are being vaccinated? And the answer to that is, if you're in a high risk environment, for example, if you work in a hospital or you're a frontline worker, there could be a rationale to ask people, are they vaccinated? But if you're in, an office space, if you're going to ask, it would be on an anonymized basis, on a unanimized basis, because it's personal to that person, right? And you cannot force anybody to get the vaccine if they don't want to. That's their own personal choice. If they have their own reasons, their own medical reasons, whatever that might be. But but then it gets into the piece of, what if I have 5 people that are vaccinated and 5 people that aren't vaccinated? Do I allow 5 people back to work and not the other 5 people? And again, it's a risk assessment of the job, the risk of that. And there's no sort of one size fits all with this. You really just have to sort of take it on a case by case basis and figure out which works best. But what I would certainly say is you could not say to someone you cannot get back to work unless you get the vaccine. I mean, that's going a step too far. But there might be that you could sort of say, well, we could safely allow these people back because they have been vaccinated, for example. But you do have to bear in mind that some people will just ultimately decide for their own reason that they don't want to get vaccine. And you have to respect that right to privacy. And I suppose, the other thing that came out in the protocol, and it's a very good point, is to educate the staff. A lot of people don't understand, there's so much stuff going around the social media and the news, don't get this vaccine because, you might grow an extra arm or, all this crazy stuff. So, educate your staff, explain to them about the vaccine, as much as you can. The HSE has lots of guidelines on this and just inform them. And, and then they're free to make their own choice, on whatever they want to do. But, I think that's certainly a worthwhile exercise, just to sort of to get people more informed and more aware of what's going on. So just on a general basis. So again, in light of all this, if you are bringing in any sort of policy around vaccines or antigen tests, you need to sort of deal with that in your risk assessment. Again, consider if any other policies need to be updated. I'm mainly thinking there of your privacy statement or your data protection documents. That's really the main one that will come to mind. Make sure that management are aware of the protocols. Like we all know someone who would go rogue and sort of ask a question when they're not allowed to ask the question. So what the policy is, we just don't care about vaccines and we're not going near. Make sure that that's well documented. Make sure that that's well communicated. People are uncomfortable with the question. Some people are not uncomfortable with the question, but some people are uncomfortable with the question. So you have to just remember that, not just because, you're fine with it, somebody else may not be fine with it. As I said, update your data protection documentation. And as I said with the antigen test, don't get relaxed on the basic safety requirements. So, this comes part of the overall training. Remember the very basics of what we're doing. Look, we might put in these extra measures in place, but the basics still apply. Even if you get, you show you have the antibody, that's not to say you couldn't still spread COVID. So it's just to educate people and to make them more aware of everything. So next of all, I just want to talk about the statutory sick pay. At the moment, there's no obligation in Ireland to pay sick pay. If an employee goes out sick and you want to pay sick pay, it's a matter of contract what you want to do. There's a state benefit that kicks in after they're out. I think it's actually 3 days now, an illness benefit. And that's just subject to them having, made suitable care side contributions. There is a bill currently in play, the Sick Leave Parental Leave COVID Bill 2020. Now, it's only at the second stage, it's all airing. If it does come in, what they're saying is employers will have to pay 4 weeks full sick pay if somebody suffers a workplace related injury, and 6 weeks or 30 days otherwise. I'm not really sure why I would have said it's the flip of it, but as I said, it's a very early day bill. So I think we'll just have to sort of watch this space on that one. Like our comparators in the UK have paid sick pay for quite some time to an extent. So we are somewhat behind the curve on this. So we'll just have to see what changes or what not come in on that one. So another sort of recent change is the Protected Disclosures Act. So there's a new bill that's coming in, expected to come in by the end of this year, and it came about by an EU directive on the Protected Disclosures Act. And I suppose the main things to be aware of, it extends the scope to people who can make a protected disclosure. As I said, it's volunteers, unpaid trainees, board members, shareholders, and job applicants. From the 17th of December 2023, if your organisation has 50 employees or more, you must have a protected disclosure policy in place, and you must have mechanisms in place in which somebody can make a protected disclosure. The bill also has specific procedures in place about if someone makes a protected disclosure, what you must do. For example, you must respond to that person within 7 days. You must sort of give them a plan of, how it's going to be investigated. They're not necessarily involved, but you need to sort of keep them updated with that and tell them who's going to investigate it. And then you're also obligated to tell them the outcome of that investigation. And then the other sort of interesting piece is with the civil claims, and the onus of proof now is being switched. So it's now presumed. So under the current legislation, you can go into the civil courts, into the circuit court specifically, and seek an injunction if you can show that you were penalised for having made a protected disclosure. Currently, the onus of proof is on the employee to show that they were penalised, whereas now it's going to switch. It's going to presume that the employee was penalised, and the employer must disprove that. So it brings it sort of in line with the Unfair Dismissal Act, but it does mean that it's going to be a higher burden for employers. But I mean, I suppose from my experience, I tend to find that when it comes to whistleblowing and protected disclosures, employers act extremely cautiously. It's just one of those pieces of legislation I find it sort of terrifies a lot of employers. So the next one is the new bullying code of practice. I mean, I say new, but I mean, it came in December last year. But like all these things, we're sort of only getting to grips with it now. I mean, I think sort of watch this space within a year's time and see how the WRC reacts to, the changes to the code of practice. There certainly are some grey areas in it that's not entirely clear and they're up for interpretation. But I suppose, the main things to flag about it is, it does very clearly distinguish the difference between bullying and harassment. I think that's something we use interchangeably sometimes. Bullying is a sort of repeated event, where it undermines the person's dignity at work, whereas harassment can be a one-off event. And it's linked into, one of or more of the 9 grounds of discrimination under the Employment Equality Act. So they are quite separate. And we should remember there was a code of practice that came out, I think, 2 years ago on harassment, sexual harassment. So, they are separate, but that's not to say you can't have bullying and harassment claim. That certainly happens, but they are two separate things. So one of the new things that have come about from this code is this 2-stage informal process. So previously you would have probably had, an informal process, which you could have skipped if it didn't lie well with the informal process, and then you would have went to a formal investigation and then an appeal of that if you wanted. Whereas now there's a 2-stage informal process, with the idea being that, let's try and work out at the very early stages, and rather than sort of letting it escalate and getting out of hand. And the thought is, if employees are aware that they can have these informal chats quite easily, it might get sort of nipped in the bud a lot sooner than, if it was sort of left to sort of grow and fester. So as part of this informal process, they call the first process is dealt by what's called the contact person. And then the second is dealt by the nominated person. The nominated person would appear to seem to have, sort of more training probably than the contact person. Like my understanding of the contact person could even just probably be a manager, it's just somebody that they feel that they trust, that they can go and speak to, and they could sort of help, have a sort of conversation between the two people involved to try and resolve it. And then if that doesn't work, then you go to a nominated person. And that might be HR person if you have a HR function, or it might need to be someone a bit more senior, or indeed it could be an external person if you use an external HR provider or anything like that. But the nominated person, while they're a little bit different, is they need to be able to sort of identify, the nature. They need to sort of dig a little bit deeper, but keeping it informal. And this is where I see there's going to be a lot of problems. Because they're not running an investigation, but they're still entitled to meet with witnesses. So you're not creating formal witness statements, which is quite difficult then, if you play it aside. If I'm an employee and I make a bullying complaint and I say, Jimmy's bullied me and, I don't know, Sandra witnessed this, you go and speak to Sandra, but all you can do is just sort of tell the other person what they've said. They don't get the sort of the formal documentation and the formal perimeters around that. So, and that's quite difficult to manage. So I'm not sure how well that's going to really work in practical sense. To me, the nominated person is nearly like they're just another person trying to come in with fresh eyes, just to be like, can we resolve this on an informed basis? Okay, no, this needs to be dealt with formally, and to merely explain to that person what that involves, how the process would look. Again, to sort of give that bit of reassurance, to the person alleging, and then also to the perpetrator. You have to remember in these that you have a duty of care to both people. You're still investigating this. You don't know who's right or who's wrong, if it's malicious or what. So it's very much a balancing act in terms of getting that. So that's all there is really about the bullying code of practice. It's just that sort of difference in the informal process. So the other new thing that you may or may not have seen a lot about on LinkedIn and whatnot is this recent Supreme Court decision, Zalewski versus the adjudication officer. I'm not going to get into too much detail about the case or anything like that, but basically what has ruled out of that, and it's created a huge backlog of cases, is basically the swearing of evidence, swearing under oath, and decisions no longer being anonymized and public being allowed in. So currently, as the WRC stands, all decisions are anonymized unless they're an employment equality claim. Nobody is allowed in unless you're, part of parties to the complaint or legal representatives or whatever that might be. And no evidence can be sworn under oath, which doesn't really make sense if you think about it, but that's the way. So now, following the Supreme Court decision, we're going to have legislation is going to have to come in, and it means then that all cases can now be heard in public, and they're allowing cases to be heard in public. So even though they're remote hearings, somebody from, say, the Irish Times can email the WRC and say, I see this hearing's on Blaithnaid, I'd like to attend. And depending on the amount of people that are already in the hearing in terms of the party, that person may or may not be allowed in, and you won't know that until the day of the hearing. And then obviously when we go into the actual face-to-face hearings, they could just sort of turn up for the hearings. Some of you may or may not remember the old days of EAT, and that often is what would happen. You'd have somebody sitting there in the back of the room from the Irish Times or the Independent, and they might sit there for 10 or 20 minutes, figure out if it's interesting to them, and then just leave. So obviously that can have a sort of damaging effect for an employer, but it can also have a damaging effect for an employee. There is, it swings both ways on this. What's happening on a practical sense of this is if you have a hearing and there's a conflict of evidence, which obviously the majority of them are, you can ask that the case is adjourned until this new legislation comes in, whereby all evidence has to be given under oath. So what the WRC I'm finding is doing on a practical basis is they're actually making everybody turn up for the hearing on a remote basis, and then they're adjourning it on the day, and then it's just sort of put back into the list. So whilst there was a backlog already with the remote hearings, there's going to be probably even more of a backlog on foot of this. So we'll have to just see the crazy impact this is going to have. So my last slide, just glad to hear, is on the gender pay gap. This is just something I'm really interested in, and it's actually come back on the table with the new government. It was sort of in the ether, and then COVID happened, then it got put to the back burner, but now it's come back on, and it's now at the 5th stage. I don't want to say it's going to come in this year, because they keep saying every year they're going to bring in this new gender pay gap legislation. We'll have to just see. Hopefully it does. The likes of the UK have this in now for 2 or 3 years. Right. What I would say is, so the only information we have is back from 2017, and it's at 14.4. And I was looking at figures for the UK, and interestingly, their pay gap increased in 2020. I think from the top of my head, in 2019 it was 12.9. In 2020 it was 15 something. Now, I understand the difference in that is because when the first year of the gender pay gap came out, people tried to get round loopholes and not necessarily disclose the information. So I would imagine the 2020 figure is probably the more realistic figure. But I suppose, like, on a general basis, I mean, organisations with only 250 more staff will have to do gender pay gap reporting for the first year. you have to look at your mean and median wages for men and women, bonuses, and then you're also looking at part-time and full-time employees. It will ultimately get down to as low as employers with 50 plus staff, but that won't be until the 3rd anniversary of the Act. And you are able to put in an explanatory report, if you are reporting on the gender pay gap, just to sort of explain if there's any particular reason, because sometimes data can be very misleading. So the report is obviously extremely important for that. Another thing that came in with the latest draft of the bill is they're giving more enforcement rights to the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission at the moment. Previously, they had very little power in this, and it was like, well, if you don't do the reporting, nothing really could happen. Whereas now they can bring you into the civil courts to, force you to do the reporting. But I suppose, my and any talk I have seen in this and my general view on it, if you have any interest in this, and it can help with recruitment, right? Particularly in the millennials field, they're really interested in the gender pay gap, and there's companies out there that have the software and whatnot to do this, and it can help from a recruitment perspective, if people get this information, to show, it really enforces the equal opportunities piece, that you are thinking about this, and you are trying to make it a more level playing field. So just because it may not cover you, my feel on it would be, necessarily rule it out. So that's my whistle stop tour for today. I hope you all find it very interesting. I'm going to hand you back over now to Mary, but as I said, at the end of this, feel free to ask any questions you might have. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thanks very much, Bláithnaid. I've been busy scribbling away. I left 2 pages for notes, but I've actually gone over that. So thanks very much. There's an awful lot of information there on that. And we're going to come back to the questions. There are some questions coming in the chat box. I'm just going to go ahead and do my quick presentation. It won't take too long, and it'll pick up on some of the points that Blán has mentioned in her presentation, because it is all relating to reasonable accommodations and supporting people back to work. So I'm just going to share my screen. And Colin, can you just give me a thumbs up that you can see that, because I can see your face on my screen. Perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm just going to reduce that down. So I just wanted to share some information on this reasonable accommodation passport, and I think it's a really good opportunity to highlight it in terms of supporting people to return to work after the, not necessarily an absence, because not a lot of people have been working, but just the absence in the workplace. And this reasonable accommodation is really just to allow discussions to happen to support people to come back to work. And it really also drives the agenda of equality and equity at work, because, when you're working in a team and you're all doing the same job, you might look around and you think, well, we're all equal. But when you are working with a team, you don't actually possibly realize that their reality is completely different to yours, and you may not be aware or know what's going on in their life, because, as Blán said, we are entitled to our privacy, and we don't have to disclose everything about our lives and what's going on in our lives. But so I am a big advocate for disclosure, because I think if you have an issue at work, or is triggered by work, or is exacerbated by work, then I think, if you don't share with somebody in work, it's never going to be addressed, and if you're never going to get the right support. So from the outset, I will say that I am a big advocate for disclosure wherever and whenever possible. So I want to share some information, as I said, on this reasonable accommodation passport. It was launched in 2019, and it is a joint venture between IBEC and Congress, which is the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. And it was, the whole idea of this was brought to their attention from the TUC, which is the Trade Union Congress over in the UK, where they put together this reasonable accommodation passport. And it was put together to really allow facilitate conversations to happen, to make sure that people and it was predominantly aimed at people with disabilities to make sure that they were included in the workforce, they were included in accessing employment, to be able to further their careers within their employment, and to make sure that they are included and that they feel included. So that they can carry out their work on an equal basis with everybody. So when you have these conversations, it ensures that everybody has a better understanding of the needs of an individual. But I think that this can have a much broader use, because yes, it was put together to support people with disabilities, but I think now, as we all are having to navigate, am I going to go back to the office? Am I not? What's going to happen with this? I have concern about going back. I'm vaccinated or I'm not vaccinated. People aren't, and all of these different anxieties. I think this is a really good tool that can be used for inclusion and to address inclusion going forward, because it can be used as a temporary thing for a person who just might need an accommodation on a short-term basis. And it doesn't have to be anything about disability. It's just they're going through a challenge of their life and they just need a little bit of help. And I think we know none of us can get through our lives without having some point in our lives that we just need a little bit of flexibility, an understanding year, or whatever it is, to help us get through that. And I think this is a really good tool to help us get through that. It also can help an organisation to address some of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, as you might have heard them. So the whole idea of decent work, it forms part of the agenda for 2030, which is where these 17 Sustainable Development Goals are. So over the next number of years, now I took this quote from when they launched it, so it's now, we have less than 11 years. But by 2030, the aim of this Agenda 2030 and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals is that by 2030 that we will achieve a full and productive employment and decent work for all women and men, including for young people and persons with disability, equal pay for work of equal value. Okay, so I don't know if this is all new to you all, but it's very interesting. And I think why it's all going to be very interesting is that this information here was taken from fact sheet number 4, which was published by the NDA, or the National Disability Authority. So they are making an estimation that the Irish population, it will grow to 5.2 million by the year 2026. So because there are going to be more people, it also means that there are going to be more older people, because we are living longer. And if you take the statistic that 80% of adults with a disability acquire their disability in their working life. So as we are aging and as we're working longer, it opens up the likelihood that more and more of us will experience some kind of challenge or a health condition in our working life. So the NDA are expecting that because of this increase in population and that people are working longer and there will be more older people, that by 2026 that the number of people that have a disability will have increased by 20%. So that's a huge number. That also has an impact on the government to provide disability services and the cost of it. So we're not here to talk about the cost and how they're going to manage that. Hopefully they will. On the right there's a map of Ireland, and it just shows, and I just thought it was really interesting, it shows the demographic of what they expect as to where people are going to, where people will be living, and the age profile. So the green is, these are the areas that have a higher proportion of people with disabilities. And then the light blue, the graph is actually wrong. It says between 12 and 14%. And then all the pink areas is less than 16. And I don't know what's going down around Cork, but Cork has got the highest percentage of people in areas. So the whole middle areas where the pinks are, they're the counties that, the people are leaving more and migrating more towards the big capital cities and the the rural areas. So there's less people living in quite a lot of these counties. So there are more older people, and hence the predicted increase in the number of people living in these counties that have disabilities. So I just thought it was really interesting to see, where things are going, and if you're located in these counties, then you might have staff who are looking for accommodations. The passport follows the social model of disability, and the IBEC and Congress have adopted this in putting forward this passport. And the focus really is on the way society is organised. So it sees the person first and argues that the barriers that they face in combination with their impairments is what disables them. So it's the built environment. It is our the difficulty people have in accessing the built environment to go to work, to go in to attend college, or to go shopping, or maybe job descriptions that are only just being published on LinkedIn, and people that might have maybe visual impairments or maybe learning difficulty mightn't be able to see all of these. Or maybe people have to fill in their applications online and they're not really terribly confident working on a computer and would prefer to post, this old-fashioned idea of posting an application in. So making sure that everything is accessible to everybody, to widen the access to everybody for recruitment purposes, and then to hopefully to move on through work. So the Employment Equality Acts, they also put an obligation on employers to provide an employee who has a disability with reasonable accommodation. But as I said, I really think that this passport can be used as a tool to open up the whole idea of inclusion for everybody. So the purpose of the passport is really to provide reasonable accommodations for a person who has a disability. But as I said, I would open that up to anybody. And I really think that this could be used as part of a recruitment process to demonstrate to candidates that that you are an organisation that supports people that have different needs, and that you are accessible, you're and an equal opportunities employer. So I think this could really be a very positive thing for people to see in an employer. So it will allow a person to access employment, to participate or advance in employment, and to undergo training while in work. What is the passport? It is designed for people who require adjustments or accommodations if they have a disability, an impairment, a health condition, a mental health issue, or a long-term injury. So it's a written record of an accommodation that is agreed between the employee and their line manager. And sometimes it could be just a temporary thing, it could be a short-term thing, but obviously then for some people there are long-term health conditions or injuries that might need to be managed. The whole concept of the passport is that it is a live document, because just because you have a disability doesn't mean that it's not degenerative, or that it might be a condition that you can make a recovery from. So it's only just something that you might need for a particular period of time. So it is live, so it is going to continuously reflect the needs of the person. So there is a built-in review period to make sure that the current situation of the employee is being addressed. And also that maybe technology is advancing. So maybe the technology that the person is using now in 6 months' time might be out of date, and there might be new updates that a person might need. So that's an important part to think as well. So it also gives the opportunity for the employer and the employee to review the person's job or their role, because their role might change. Blaithnaid had mentioned earlier on that coming back from maybe from a COVID scenario, that a person can't actually come on site because it's not safe for them to do so. So we might maybe look at changing and putting in a short-term accommodation to change their role to allow them to remain working from home, and they might need maybe some other kind of accommodations to take up the new role. So, for a person who has a condition or an impairment of some sort, it's not always going to be the same for them. And a lot of people have conditions that have flare-ups like fibromyalgia, people who have MS, people who have multiple sclerosis, people who suffer from with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. All of these things like flare up and just need an understanding and an agreement with work that if they have a flare up, that there is a protocol in place, because we're very familiar with the word protocol now, to be able to manage that in line with their needs. Okay. What's required on behalf of the individual is courage, because for the first time ever, a person might be disclosing to work that they have a health impairment, they have a condition, and they are concerned about going back into the workplace after COVID because they may not feel safe. So it's a really big thing. It's not just a case of, oh, we're going to go back, or we're not going to go back, we're going to go back in hybrid or whatever it is. There's going to be some real courageous decisions to be made by people who might be disclosing that, or they might maybe have a family member who they are looking after who has a health condition, and the person is afraid to go back to work in case they get exposed to COVID and they bring it back home to their family member. So it's a really big, difficult thing for some people who are going to have to make that decision. So I would encourage anybody who, whether or not you use this passport, or if you have this conversation, to just listen to the person and try and understand from their perspective what is going on in their lives with respect and patience. Because, just to give an example, I was in conversation with somebody and they were having a real difficulty trying to get somebody to come back to work, and she was just having none of it. She said, I'm just not going back, and she was throwing all sorts of reasons. But her biggest worry for her at that time was that she was going to have to travel on public transport, and she really didn't feel happy because at the time the government was saying, don't travel on public transport. And that was her only mode of transport to work. And she was having a real difficulty trying to get herself around the idea of getting on a bus going to work. So sometimes what's presented isn't always the real reason behind it. So that's why we really have to listen and understand and try and get to the back of everything. So that does take patience sometimes. Okay, how it works. If you are going to use a passport, and not just, as I said, not just for disability, but the whole idea of the passport is how it works. It enables the employee to have discussions with their workplace, and gives them an opportunity to share the impact of their working conditions on them, the barriers that they encounter that may stop them or prevent them from participating fully at work, to talk about any change to their health or circumstances, because some conditions are degenerative, and 1 year to the next, particularly people who have multiple sclerosis, that can change. People who have health conditions or mental health conditions that might be triggered with maybe their work pattern. So if they are working at particularly busy times, and coming up to Christmas is a particularly busy time in their work, they know that every time coming up to Christmas, they're going to get anxious about how they get their work done. So, look at fluctuations and if there are any patterns in it. What adjustments do they think will make it easier for them to fully participate? They know themselves better than anybody, and they know what they need to be able to do their job. So, listen to them, talk to them, and be open to exploring things with them. And also review the effectiveness of the accommodations provided on an ongoing basis. The passport would suggest a review every 6 months to make sure that the accommodations are still current and reflective and supportive of the person. The person as well, depending on the condition, they need to be reassured that their manager will know what to do if they become unwell at work, when to contact emergency services, and who to contact if necessary. And to give you another example as to how this might work, I was in conversation back about 2 or 3 years ago when we were all able to go to in-person events. But I met a girl who in her 20s, she had a massive seizure, turned out to be epilepsy, and she decided that she would pull her entire team, and there was only about 20 or so in the team. She pulled them all together. She explained what epilepsy is. She explained everything about her medications, the impact it has on her, and that going forward, she called them as she kind of got to know a bit more about the epilepsy and her seizures became more frequent. They discovered that she always fell to the left-hand side, and there were a couple of behaviors that she would do, which was kind of giving an indication that there was a seizure coming on. So she learned about her own condition, but she also shared that with her team so that they all knew what to do, and if a certain amount of time had passed and she wasn't coming out of a seizure, what to do and who to contact. So that gave her a huge reassurance, and of course then it also reassured her team, that they knew what to do. So I think it's really important, again, as I said, huge disclosure fan. And if the person is sick and absent from work, that they have agreed, and that person will know how and when their manager will keep in touch with them if they are absent from the work due to their disability. You might also consider including some information from a GP, a specialist, or some other expert if it's appropriate to support their request for accommodations. So that's really how and what kind of conversations you might have if you were to use the passport. Going forward, it will allow a line manager to follow up and implement the adjustments. The passport holder is the person who holds it, and they share it with anyone that they think needs to know about the accommodations. So this removes the need for employees to potentially having to repeat difficult conversations or to renegotiate their accommodations every time there's a change in their role or there's a change in manager, which can be something that can be very stressful, and we don't want to put that stress on a person. The passport can be part of a handover document if agreed with the passport holder that they can do that. Okay, so the review, as I said, it should be held about every 6 months or so for the two main reasons: is to ensure that the accommodations remain effective in removing or reducing the identified workplace barriers for the individual, and if they are found to no longer meet the requirements of the individual, that maybe they've recovered from their condition, or maybe if they had a temporary reduction of hours, or they were starting to work at a later point in time and finishing later, that they might be able to come back to their normal working hours, or whatever it is. So just going forward to make sure that reviews are done on a regular basis. I've put together some information or some links here, and I think these slides are going to be made available online. So there's a PDF there with some information and a sample of the passport and what it looks like. It's a very simple Word document, and I think if people aren't going to use that, certainly in question 6 of the pre-return to work form that every employee is going to have to fill in prior to their return to the physical workplace, which asks if a person has any condition or any concern about returning to the workplace, and they're asked to share that. So either use the accommodation as a kind of an extra tool, but certainly the pre-return to work form, everybody's going to have to fill in, ask that question. It's question number 6. So you might find yourselves hearing from people who have a concern, and it might be the first time that you will hear that about them. So just be prepared for having these conversations and just being open to explore and question them as to what they think that they might need, and sometimes be prepared to kind of probe a little bit more within reason. Of course, Blaithnaid would kill me if I said just keep on poking them within reason, to make sure that you are trying to find out, what support you can do to support them to come back to work. There's a link there to IREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, about what they're saying about reasonable accommodations. and then a link to the Sustainable Development Goals, and to put in place any champions within your workplace if you are particularly chasing any of the development goals within your own organisation. And of course, a link to me at the end of it as well. So that is it. That's my speak on reasonable accommodation. I'm going to stop my share and come back to the main screen and see what kind of questions we have. Okay, I think we're okay for time. We're okay for time. I think we might actually end up finishing a little bit early, but that's okay. I don't think anybody would mind having an extra few minutes back in their working day that they hadn't planned or anticipated. Okay, so questions and comments. So I'm going to start at the top. And so Joanne is saying that looks like some rocky road ahead for people managers. Blaithnaid, this was during your speak earlier on this morning. I think there is an awful lot coming down our tracks. There's legislation coming, but it is really on the backdrop of a lot of uncertainty. You even said that yourself. It's the guidelines and the policies and the codes of practice is there to help us, but how it's actually going to, to actually be in reality is going to just kind of watch this space, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We're just going to have to learn as we go. And I mean, what we have seen now is, there has been a few cases that have came out with people that have been made redundant probably in the first lockdown, and we're starting to see the decisions that are coming out of that. And a lot of people knee-jerked back then, they just panicked and let people go. And, it's come out very clearly that, just because we're in a pandemic doesn't mean you can't apply fair procedures. So, unfortunately, the emergency sort of approach to these things isn't a defence. So, you do have to, as hard as it is, keep up to date as much as you can and, follow the process. Like what I always tell clients is, think before you react, and it take a bit of time. And, whilst you might sort of think, oh, I'm going to have to let go of this person, you might not need to, and I know a lot of clients, even last year with the first temporary wage subsidy scheme, so many employers jumped onto the scheme when it first came in. And some didn't even need to go on to it in the end, they came off it. But, we're just in such nobody knows where we're going to end up. Nobody thought we were going to be in this third lockdown,
Yep.
So, and it's okay to say you don't know the answer, and I think some people sort of feel like, oh, I've got to have a solution to this, I've got to know, it's, as long as you can show that you've been reasonable in it and, you've adopted whatever policy you have, procedures there, keeping up to date in legislation, that will go towards, any employer.
Yeah, and I suppose to keep a record of it as well, to show, to be able to show the paper trail and that you have actually demonstrated fair procedure for everybody. So. There's also a link there to the Airtable. There are a lot of information this all gathered around the legislation, so it's there in the comment section. So please feel free to save the link and download any resources that you might need. Okay, there was also another question, comment. It was again during when you were speaking, Blaithnaid, somebody put in to say, important to remember the Nuremberg Code of Practice. I have to admit, I do recognize that name, but I don't know what it is. So I'm going to throw you in the deep end there.
I'm the same as you. I'm not like the name rings a bell, but I'm not familiar with it.
Okay,
so,
well.
Yeah.
Maybe if Anita, if you're still here, because and if you don't mind coming online and showing your face, maybe you might want to share. But if not, that's perfectly fine. I don't want to put anybody under pressure. Or if you don't just want to maybe put something in the chat box if you prefer, that's fine too. But we'll circle back to that maybe. Sure. A question here, does the right to privacy and bodily integrity trump the requirement to provide a safe work environment for other employees? I think I'll leave you that one with you, Blaithnaid.
It's a good question, and I don't think it's a hard no or a hard yes. It's all a balancing act, and they're all, you sort of have the management that you're sort of on a seesaw, and you have all these different factors that you have to consider, and you have to sort of weigh them up. As you said, Mary, you do have to probe people a bit. I do agree with you on that, without sort of forcing people to give away, their medical history. But, at the same time, if somebody doesn't want to come back to work and they're just saying, I'm not going to come back to work, that's not okay. There has to be a reason for that. So, you do have to probe that person. And if it gets into, if they say, oh, I have a medical reason for doing that, that can be sort of, it's not necessarily that, as the employer, you would need to know the full detail of that person's medical history. You can have to refer to sort of top health, ask them, what the prognosis is, what are the issues, and have a sort of report. So there is a balanced way of sort of getting to the solution without someone having to disclose their full sort of, personal medical history, but also, with the fact that, as an employer, you have to run your business, you have people that do it. And if somebody can't turn into work, you have to give a reason. Even outside of COVID, if somebody says, I'm not coming back to work, well, if they're resigning and they're not coming back to work, that's their prerogative. But if they're sort of refusing to come in, you need to know that reason, and, you need to work with that person.
Yeah, because I think, am I right in saying that if an employee is being told the workplace is opening up and the employer needs a person to return to work, they are legally obliged to return to work? Am I right in saying that?
Yeah, but then if they come back and they say, I'm a vulnerable person, for example, if they have some sort of pre-existing, that makes it more vulnerable, that's where it gets more complicated.
Yeah.
And what's happening is, I'm seeing a lot of people just say, I'm not coming back. And you're like, well, and then you have to ask the question, why aren't you coming back? And I've seen cases where people are just like, oh, I don't feel like, you've put enough safety measures in place, and that's why I'm saying, educate staff, explain to them what they've done. And if, and then if it's a medical reason, that would sort of put them at higher risk, then you're getting into the whole sort of reasonable accommodation piece with that, to see if there can be sort of anything that you can do, help facilitate them return to work, or indeed, that they just work from home.
Yeah, so much to talk about. Question here, how is neurodiversity treated under reasonable accommodation? For example, is autism spectrum disorder included? So under reasonable accommodations, it's for anybody. Once a person discloses that they are in need of it, there is an obligation for the employer to investigate reasonable accommodations. So I'm not, I think, but I might be corrected on this, that autism spectrum disorder is included in that. Blonde, you're nodding your head. So yes,
that's my understanding.
Yeah. And I think it doesn't really matter what the condition or the impairment is. That once a person discloses or says that I have a concern, I have a health concern, I have a condition, I can't come back to work, or whatever it is, I think now more than ever before, the employer just has to explore reasonable accommodations. It doesn't, and reasonable is in the legislation a very grey area. It doesn't say, an accommodation, has to cost less than 5,000 or whatever. It doesn't give any specifics as that. It's just reasonable as to not put an undue burden on an employer to put in an accommodation if there was cost involved. But for a lot of people, say for example, an autistic person who doesn't like a lot of background noise, and they would be noise sensitive, and they would like to have a noise cancelling headset. Why not, if it didn't cost too much to the organization, why not provide everybody with access to the headset, rather than saying, oh, look, there's Mary over there, she's got autism, she has to have a set, and everybody knows that. So if everybody had access to it, it would actually make it easier for a lot of people to do work, because they could all have access to these headsets. And then you get it's an inclusive piece of equipment that everybody in the office has, and it makes sure then that your design for your work environment is accessible and open to all. So I hope that answers that question. I presume IVF would also be covered then if couples were going through fertility treatment. I think you are entitled to time again, Blaithnaid, as you might. Am I right to say that?
Well, I would say so. Yeah, I'm not aware of any sort of specific cases or anything of it, but you know, I think it would sort of come within, if you sort of think about it, you know, in terms of, it could potentially come within one of the 9 grounds, you know, in terms of family status. So, you know, so I think you could sort of bring it in even that way, that, you know, you'd have to be sort of within reason, you know, work with the employee if they are going through the, you know, the fertility treatment. But again, that would be sort of conditional on, you'd have to disclose that to your employer. You know, there would have to be sort of that level of openness. And I'm actually seeing a lot more fertility policies actually in organisations, you know, to sort of help make this for a more open space, and so that people aren't scared to talk about it.
Yeah, that's actually really, that's great to see that coming in, because, you know, I think people are becoming more ready and more open to talking about what's going on in their lives, and if they're having a difficulty, especially the Gen Zs coming through. I don't know what way the world is going to go when these Gen Zs hit the workforce, because if they're anything like my daughter, God love the lot of you, because she has this ideal that everything is there for her. So yeah, so these accommodations are just going to go wide. The paid accommodation, the question, are these paid accommodations, by the way, as in time to attend appointments? Again, it's all about flexibility. If you have an employer who is willing to be flexible with you, that you can, you know, maybe take the morning off, but you're going to work later, or you make up the hours later on. Again, it's just all about flexibility and having the safety in work to be able to have those conversations. Okay, there's a few more questions here, and then we're going to bring in Lesa. Okay, so I think that's it on the questions. Sorry, one more message there. There is obviously cover when a woman informs her employer that she's pregnant, but would that also cover if someone divulges that they're going through IVF treatment? Yeah, so once the person discloses that she's pregnant, then obviously that she's protected for that, and there is time off allowed toward the end for the antenatal classes. I'm not 100% sure if there's if there.
There's not specific, like there's no specific legislation or anything on this. It just comes down to the employer being flexible, you know, about it. But, you know, like at the same time, if an employer outright refused it, you know, it'd be hard. I mean, I think, you know, if they had a real reason to sort of refuse you to go into an appointment because there was some sort of, you know, business demand and you'd only told them at the last second, you know, you could see that being a reasonable refusal. But if, you know, if they sort of outright, you know, refuse to allow you to go to appointment, like that would be quite disproportionate.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it all, again, everything just comes really back down to being flexible. And I think I'm seeing an awful lot more of culture first for this decade of the 20s, that we are opening up our cultures of work to being more open, to being more flexible, and to being human to human, not just business to business or business to customer. We are now going to be more human to human. So I think on that, I think I'm going to bring in Lesa now. Blaithnaid, thank you very much for that. Are you okay to stay just in case any more questions come in? Great, thank you very much. Thanks. So Lesa, so we've looked at all the policies, and we've spoken a bit about from a HR point of view, but you know, people have gone through huge disruption, and there's been an awful lot of financial worries, you know, for people who have ended up on the on maybe the PUP, and for some they want to stay there, they don't want to come back to work for lots of different reasons. People who've lost their jobs, people who are just trying to figure things out, people who are now going to be working from home, and they're looking for, you know, is there going to be any kind of allowance made, because now they're not going to be traveling, but they're going to be at home. They have to pay for the heating and all that. So can you shed any words of
elaborate on some of that? Great talks, both of those. And just my own opinion, I suppose, as an employer, I think for all of those situations and all that legislation and all those reasonable accommodations and the things that are coming down with return to work for COVID, really and truly, you know, I think everything can be avoided if you're open to conversations with your employees. You know, if you're open from the start about this, like Blaithnaid said, the situation about the safety protocols that are being put in place, if you're open with them about what is working for them and what isn't, from my own perspective, Brady Management as a company, we're all about work-life balance. Now we have all female employees, so that really does come to play when you're juggling house and school and kids and everything else behind the scenes. So I do think, listening to a lot of things, and as an employer, from my perspective, I can't understand how half of these issues come up. And I don't understand how an employer could, refuse somebody a reasonable request, to attend an appointment or go for a vaccine or whatever it is that's going to come up with COVID.
I think Lorna probably could show you a book of things and examples.
I know
where
she
that
could,
doesn't happen.
yeah, but just from my point of view, I can't understand it, because I just don't see how, things like that are going to cause conflict, and you just don't want conflict with your employees on an ongoing basis every day in business. The other thing there, just a quick suggestion, when I was listening to the practice for not interrupting your employees' private time, I think that have always been there as well. There has to be boundaries and respect, like I said, about work-life balance. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the time, if I am at home in the evening, I will draft emails, but I don't send them that evening. I'll save them in my drafts and then send them first thing in the morning. And I do also find, from a work-life balance point of view, if you send things in the evening and reply in the evenings, then it becomes the norm of a situation that, it's expected. So I kind of like to stick to the boundaries. I don't answer after 5 o'clock, or I don't correspond after that time, because I just find, or lunch hours or breaks, if you do that, then it becomes known with whoever you're dealing with, look, there's no point, because they just don't, respond outside of work hours.
Yeah, Lisa, I want to work with you.
Yes, the things there, what you're talking about, the PUP payment for a lot of people. Look, it was a very welcome relief when it came along for people who were at home and who were laid off. Unfortunately, the other side of that coin, and a lot of employers are finding this, and particularly in industries where there's low pay, like retail and stuff like that, a lot of employers are finding that staff at home now getting €350 a week don't want to come back to work, because in some cases, if they were part-time or they were traveling long distance or whatever their circumstances were, they're actually more beneficial at the moment getting that 350, and it's making it difficult for them to decide to go back to work. So that is something that we're finding with a lot of our clients, are having issues getting their staff back into work. The other point you made there, Mary, about employers having staff working from home and the benefit in kind situation. Employers can provide their staff at home with computer equipment, office desks, office furniture, whatever they need to do their job at home. That can be provided without the employee paying a benefit in kind on that situation, where that equipment is provided for the employee at home. Mm-hmm. So there is no benefit in kind around that, and there was always an accommodation with revenue for people who were working at home. So if you were self-employed, it was called a home working expense, where you could claim a reasonable percentage of your bills at home while you were there working. Now, it's literally really only around heat, light, telephone and broadband. A lot of people thought they could claim a portion of their rent or their house insurance. That doesn't come into it really. It's just, I suppose, from revenue's perspective, it's the extra expense of being in the home longer. So your heating bills and your phone bills would be higher. For the purposes of COVID, Revenue have made an accommodation for home workers, because they know there's a lot of people at home now all day, every day. And what they've stated for during COVID, now look, it'd be great if it could stay this way going forward, because it's simplified, but I'm not sure it will. It's 10% of your electricity and heating costs and 30% of your internet and broadband costs. That's what they consider reasonable expenses for being at home.
Okay. And how does that get treated then?
It's just an allowable expense.
Okay.
So if you're an employee, there's two situations really. As an employer, you can give a set amount of money per day to your employees for working at home. It's very low. It's €3.20 per day. But that's for employees who are on your payroll. So employees who are getting a pay slip, you can give them that amount of money tax-free for every day that they're working at home. I think a lot of employers did do that when COVID came up because it was a simple and easy way to do it. But there is a case for someone who's at home all day, every day, and their bills are a lot higher than €3.20 per day. And if that is the case, then at the end of the year, you've got to provide backup to revenue and say, look, the €3.20 per day didn't cover what it cost me to work at home. And I had got other higher expenses than that. And you can submit that to revenue at the end of the year, along with the backup, which would be your bills, saying, look, there's a bill pre-COVID that was only €100, and here's the bill while I'm at home working during COVID, and it's now €200. So they will look at that, but they want the backup to decide whether they will allow that. Okay. Generally, if you're self-employed, it's a case of, as I said, a percentage of those bills. And if they've simplified it for COVID, which is 10% and 30%. Any other questions about anything financial, book payment?
Can I just ask a question on that, Lesa?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely.
So,
Teresa,
if you submit that to revenue and you didn't get the €3.20 from your employer, so it's not instead of it's as well as?
It can be as well as if you believe the expense is higher than €3.20 per day. But it can also be instead of, if the employer didn't give you anything, you can absolutely put that in and say, look, I've had this expense the whole time. Or, you could submit them to revenue and they will look at that and refund you what they class as reasonable expenses for being at home.
So it's at the employer's discretion whether to give it to you or not then? Okay.
Yes, it is at the employer's discretion. To be fair, there's probably a lot of employers who are not aware of it. So there's nothing wrong with an employee going and saying, look, do you realise you can give that to me tax-free as a contribution towards my expense for being at home?
Okay, thanks.
Anything else?
Hey, Lesa, sorry, it's Joanne here. I just have a question on, as an employer, what's your thoughts when you listen to all this?
Like I said, Joanne, as an employer, for me, it's hard to understand. I mean, we were the same as everybody in the first COVID. We have a lot of clients on subscription, and within that first week, about 80% rang up and said, oh, we're stopping paying. Yeah. Because like Blaithnaid had said, people reacted and jumped and didn't think. And, like every other employer out there, we had to scramble about a situation with cash flow and having money to pay wages. So we sat with our employees and had a discussion around part-time employees and full-time employees and how we were going to manage that. We did work from home, and our employees have an option to work from home at all times, even before COVID. However, most of them choose to come to the office. So we obviously have a good atmosphere here. So, we all know as employees, a lot of the time we go to work to escape home sometimes. But for me, I can't understand how those situations develop, because I do believe if you, genuinely sit with your employee and have a conversation about their needs and what's going on at home and, how you can help with that, then it's really good, Mary, I believe, in a retention situation, helping with that. And it just avoids those issues, and I do find if you have that discussion, then the employee will be very reasonable as well as the employer being very reasonable. And for me, for me as an employer, I feel that does avoid an awful lot of those issues. Now, look, at the end of the day, sometimes you will just get a difficult employee. But generally, it is a case of listen to what's going on behind the scenes sometimes that you don't know about. As Mary said, unless somebody discloses something to you, sometimes you don't know what their circumstances are. I will say I'm at a bit of a advantage, because a lot of my staff are family. But we also have a really good relationship with the staff we have. We've a lady here who's part-time and she cares for her mum. So we make accommodations for when she needs to change her hours to go to those appointments, if she needs time off to do whatever she needs to do. And it is about being flexible and saying, okay, you know, you can swap your day or make up your hours or whatever the case may be. But that's because we were very aware of that situation when we took the employee on, you know, and it works both ways. So, yeah.
And you just raised a very interesting point, actually, for Mary and Blaithnaid as well. There's a potential for more discrimination because the obligations are so onerous, I guess, in some ways. So do you think that, you know, if you're going to suspect that an employee is going to require a lot of time off, what do you think employers can say, or how that will play out, I guess, in the talent acquisition market and the recruitment?
You can't really make an assumption that someone's going to have time off. You know, you might know, like in Lesa's case, if she knew that this employee was coming and it wasn't disclosed at maybe the interview or at any stage. So Lesa can't make an assumption that, oh, I know that this is the case and she's going to need time off. Unless the disclosure is shared at the time of recruitment or at some other point, then and then you hopefully have a nice manager like Lesa who is open and flexible to having that discussion. But you know, you can't make assumptions. But if you were to advertise jobs and saying you're an equal employer or an equal opportunities employer, that you family friendly policies, you know, that you offer flexible working, you know, on short-term arrangements or whatever, even advertise that you use the passport, you know, to help people to, you know, who are looking for reasonable accommodations for a short-term or long-term basis, then if you become known as an employer who is flexible and you have that in your policy and it's in your culture, then that will be reciprocated by the staff, is how I would hope that it would play out. And Lesa, what do you think?
Yeah, from experience, Mary, it absolutely is reciprocated from the staff. It, you know, it is a case of, well, look, I need a half an hour off today, but I'll make that up. And that's their suggestion, you know, I'll make that up another day. So I'll come in an hour earlier on that day to have the hour off when I need the hour off. So it becomes a really good working relationship because there's flexibility on both sides.
Yeah.
And I do think that is really, really important, and probably never more so than when we come back after COVID, because of, you know, there could be a situation where somebody at home gets ill, or they may need to quarantine because somebody at home is infected, or, you know, any of the situations that come up, time off for a vaccine, you know, those situations are going to arise, and there probably is going to be a really bigger need for that flexibility and adaptability. And look, there is some cases where that's not possible. You know, my situation is it's office based, you know, and there is the option to work that extra hour or come in that hour earlier. And that may not be the case for all businesses, but I definitely think, you know, one of the main things that employers are going to need going forward is that flexibility and adaptability. And generally, like you said, Mary, if that's the employee knows that before they come on board or before they come back to work, it's going to reduce the anxiety level, for one, as Blaithnaid had said, because that is going to be there. I mean, we all found it at home when you were stuck at home for 5 months. I'm a vulnerable person, so for in a lot of COVID in the beginning, I stayed inside the whole time, and everybody else went out and shopping and whatever was needed to be done. But, you know, my sons would say to me, you know, the world is still going on outside there, man. You know, you think that the whole place is shut down, and it hasn't, you know. And that can happen, as Blaithnaid had said, for somebody who's stuck at home now for that amount of time. There is a level of anxiety building there about going back out, about mixing with people, about their office environment. And if that's explained to them before they come back to work, you know, the procedures that are there. And, you know, one of the procedures we have every day is a sanitization procedure. And, you know, we've discussed it here, saying, you know, how long are we going to continue that for? And when will there be a stage when we're comfortable to stop that? Because it's become part of the normal routine now, you know, and when will we feel comfortable and safe that we're okay to stop doing that? So that's all part of the discussions and the conversations. And like I said, what it comes back to is communicating And that's going to be really, really top of the list for the return to work situation between employers and employees.
I think so. And you raised a question there, and actually it was one of the questions I wanted to ask Blaithnaid as well. Blaithnaid, Lesa mentioned there about employees taking time off for vaccines. What is the case of that? Is that allowable for people just to kind of pop out for the hour or so to get their vaccines and come back, or is it paid or is it unpaid? How is that treated,
I think, again, it's entirely up to the employer. Like, there's no legislation there to say that you must give someone a paid time off for vaccine. But being a reasonable employer, and so long as you're given sufficient notice of the appointment, and, it doesn't affect, if there was something urgent on at the time, and for example, they came in and said an hour beforehand, oh, I have a, appointment for a vaccine, you could see that being reasonable, saying, like, this is quite difficult, but it's entirely up to the employer. But I completely echo what Lesa is saying, the more upfront that you are with staff, the more staff will be upfront with you, and if it's just, look, it's entirely up to yourself whether you get the vaccine, but if you want to get it, just give us as much notice as you can, and you'll be able to take the time off for it, and people will really respect that, and sort of say, right, okay, that's grand, look, it's at whatever time, because you've no control over it either, that's what you have to remember, you just get this text message to say you need to be here at this time and go with it. So I'm not sure how much notice you get, but I do presume you get some amount of notice, on the time of the appointment. So it's just entirely up to the employer. But could an employee bring in a case because the employer wouldn't give them the time off for an appointment? There's no real legislation there. I mean, they could potentially bring a claim under the Industrial Relations Act. But that would have to be a very bitter employee, to go down that road, because, you'd be looking at maybe being docked half a day's pay if an employer was going to do that. Likewise, I suppose the other point there would be any sort of sick pay policy or anything that you have there in terms of what the company's policy is on taking, doctor's appointments or whatever. Usually most policies will say, you'll get time off for that so long as you give, reasonable notice, try and make it the end of the day or the first thing, so it's just all about the reasonable of it. But I would say the best way to approach it is to just go to staff at the very outset, and say, look, we're willing to give you the time off for it, but just be upfront with us and just, give me as much notice as you can so that we can work around it.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah. Colin, you raised a hand there.
Yeah, just actually, it's another question there for Blaithnaid. I know bombarding you with these questions,
Right.
But I suppose it's more in relation to the idea behind long COVID, and the time off, etc., that might be required. I've just spoken to some people. Some have said, every now and again they get floored for a day or two, or even a week on it. How is that going to be covered? Is that going to be just under general sick leave, or?
Yeah, well, it'll just be under the company in terms of any, time off. And that's why, this bill is in play for sick pay, because especially the small companies, if people have COVID, we all know, it's 3 weeks, right, is the general rule of thumb. And like you say, I know plenty of people who've had it and, they're fine one day and then, they're not, for another day. Likewise with the vaccine. Some people are getting very poorly, after they take in the vaccine. So it's entirely up to the employer in terms of, what they do there. And it's all going to come down to one, what their policy is on sick pay. And two, if they don't pay sick pay, for example, they have to look at their affordability. You can't say to one employee, oh, you got COVID, I'll pay you, and then the next person not pay them. You've got to be transparent and you've got to adopt it equally. So, an employer might say, look, we'll pay for the first week, but unfortunately after that, we just can't pay anymore, and that wouldn't be unreasonable, especially if it's a small organization and you don't pay sick pay. And you have to remember that, the COVID illness benefit is $350 a week. It is more than the normal illness benefit, and once you have that the letter from your doctor, there's no reason why that person won't get it, and they'll get it from day one. So again, I suppose it's partly is just letting staff know of that. You know, they may not know, they may just think that all they can get is the normal illness benefit, which I'm not sure what it's by 200 and something a week. I'm not sure exactly, you know, so that would give them that extra level of comfort. But, you know, there does have to be that sort of balancing act too of what an employer can afford, you know, but with also being reasonable with its staff.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
And just a very quick follow-up on that one, just from there, understand that's on the employer's point of view and side of it. But what about, for example, insurance? If you've taken out insurance on, you know, the illness benefits and so on for, what's it called?
Like the income protection, is it?
Income protection, that kind of idea.
PHI, is it? Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
right, yeah.
How would that fall into?
Yeah, well, that doesn't usually kick in until an employee is out sick for more than 6 months.
Yeah.
That's usually the condition of that. And then they'll be assessed by the doctor related to, it's usually Irish Life is the most common one of it, but they'll be assessed by that. And then it's 70% of the pay. So, I mean, you would like to think, touch wood, you know, the majority of people would not be out for COVID, you know, for more than 6 months. And if they are, you know, then they are really very ill, you know, and that is the right place for them if a company has that policy.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
You guys, I have a few questions just on COVID, so I'll ask them all together. So it's probably the easiest. The first thing I'm wondering about is, you know, people have this COVID vaccine passport that they can show if they want to travel. But when you're thinking about bringing people back to the office, you can't ask them for proof of being vaccinated, is my understanding. So that means you have people coming back to the office who will be uncomfortable with unvaccinated people around. So that's the first part of the question. And then I assume when somebody's sick with COVID, you'll get a certification from the doctor to say that they're ill. Mm-hmm. But then when the isolation kicks in, so let's say they would need to self-quarantine because somebody they know has been ill, what paperwork or evidence do you take from that? And then the third part is if somebody gets sick at work and they think they catch COVID at work, then is the responsibility then for the employer? I mean, there's lots of grey areas around this area.
Okay, I'll go backwards, right? So the third one, if a person, let's say they get COVID, obviously if they don't get COVID, you know, that's fine. But if the person gets COVID, like this has been, it's a lot of discussion around practitioners, who's going to be liable, right? And you can imagine in America, they're going to have a field day on this, right? But we're a very different climate here. But it'll come down to, you know, have you adopted the return to work safety protocol? Have you put measures in place by educating your staff, telling them you have obligations, we have obligations, and are you doing that? You know, it's like even if the employee slips in the workplace, you know, and like you've given them training saying, you know, don't leave files in the middle of, you know, of the middle of the floor and then they trip over it. You know, they'd be very hard pushed to then try and blame an employer. Yeah. So that's why the training, the return to work protocol, all of that is key to educate the staff so that they are aware. And if, you know, if they've, and like I said earlier, you know, the protocol now brings in the point that like employees' responsibility is continuous. You know, it's when they go out, you know, if they go to a party at the weekend, obviously they're free to do whatever they want, but you have to be mindful now that you could come in and be a spreader. You know, you could get COVID at that party, come in. So you need to sort of educate them and inform them. So, you know, and if an employer can show that they have done everything that they can do there, it would be very hard for an employer to be, you know, quite liable, you know, for that person having got COVID. But like on the flip of that, if you do absolutely nothing, you know, and there's no measures in place, ultimately, I think an employer could find, you know, that they could be liable. I mean, what they would be liable for in terms of damages and stuff is that, you know, that's another sort of kettle of fish. I mean, it would, you know, it'd be sort of loss of wages if they weren't being paid and if there was, you know, any sort of long-term effect. But it still would be limited, you know, because it is a pandemic and, you know, you can't protect everybody from getting COVID. I mean, that's just, unfortunately, the world that we live in. As for the isolation piece, you can still get, if you have to isolate because you've came into contact with somebody from COVID, you can still get the illness benefit, the COVID illness benefit. And as far as I understand, you can get, and to get that, then you would get a letter from the doctor. So, you know, it can either be from the person you've got it from, if it's like, for example, your husband, your wife, your father, or whatever it might be, or indeed, your own doctor. If you can say, look, this person has got it, they should be able to provide with a letter to say you need to isolate for X amount of time, and that'll also entitle you to get the COVID illness benefit. And then your first question, I can't remember.
Oh yeah, what is the proof that you can ask? Like if somebody says they have COVID or they have a vaccine, can you ask them or?
All right, yeah. Yeah, and this is the difficult one. The short answer is no. Well, sorry, no, that's not the short answer. It depends on the type of work environment. If you're like a frontline worker, for example, or an environment where it's high risk, then I believe you legitimately can ask that person, have you got the COVID vaccine? If they say, no, I don't want to get it, that's when it becomes problematic, because you can't force someone to get the vaccine, and you can't terminate someone because they don't want to get the vaccine. You're then getting into the sort of whole, then you have to sort of gently probe them, as Mary would say, to sort of find out why are they not getting the vaccine, and is there any sort of reasonable measures that can be put in place to adopt that?
Yeah.
And then you balance that with sort of an office space that wouldn't really be high risk compared to, say, a frontline worker. I don't believe you can ask people, have you got the vaccine? If they don't want to tell you, you can't force that information out of them. There's again, and then, but how I see that coming out is somebody who might, refuse to return to work. And then you're like, okay, well, why are you refusing to return to work? They have to give you some sort of information there as to why they don't want to come back.
And if they didn't want to come back because they're vulnerable and they're not sure who's vaccinated, is that reasonable?
So then if they're vulnerable, then you're getting into like reasonable accommodation piece. So like what I would be saying is, okay, well, maybe let's get you sort of assessed by Oc Health, to see what they might recommend in terms of, like, for example, and I as I said, I'm not a doctor, but they might say, okay, let's wait another 3 months and assess this. For the time being, you can continue to work from home. Like, it tends to be a continuous assessment, and they keep sort of updating it. But it probably will come out, but you can't outright turn around to people and say, can you confirm if you've had the vaccine? But I do believe within reason, if you have an open workspace, where people are sort of, there's a lot of trust in that, and people get on quite well, and it probably akin more to a smaller environment, people will tell you that information. But you certainly can't sort of, force someone to give over, whether they've had a vaccine or not in an office type of environment.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I have a really question of interest, actually, that I've been pondering for a while. So since we sent people home to work from home, and there has been very few companies, as far as I know, that have provided, working from home guidelines around seating position and where you're sat. And do you think that there is going to be, or have you seen any increase in how people, like even litigations around, working from home injuries or issues?
Yeah.
I can see it coming.
Yeah, I can definitely see it coming. Yeah. The sort of working from your bed and, all of this. Like what we've done in Leman is we've had someone actually do like a Zoom call or Teams call with each individual person to do a virtual risk assessment of where they're working and where if someone's not, actually everybody agreed to it, but we did had to presume that somebody wouldn't be comfortable with it, so then we were like, okay, well, we nearly needed to confirm why we were doing this, and that they sort of agreed by not doing this, then they're taking on the obligation, and it's not that, it doesn't become our responsibility. But like, and that's where the remote working policy is quite important, because you're saying, look, you're allowed to work from home on foot of this risk assessment on the basis that you work at this, at the desk that was assessed, etc. And, and then saying, if there's any material change to your working environment, you must notify your employer, i.e. your desk breaks, or I don't know, something, extravagant like that, but you do have to adapt. Like my own personal circumstances, I broke my ankle in the middle of all of this. So I just had to work from my bed because I had to keep my ankle. You know,
You didn't trip over a plug from your, you know.
no, I was, you know, getting out for like our walks every day and walking the dog and felt real awkward. It's really undramatic from it, but you know, but it's that circumstance, you know. So you, again, it's just a movable feast. Is the only way.
And there does have to be a little bit of common sense around all of it. And I think what Blaithnaid's saying, that, you know, even if it does come to litigation or a case where you're, you know, up you know, in front of the Working Relations Commission or whatever, like those common sense principles are going to come into play. You know, and as Blaithnaid said, how much did the employer do to avoid the risk, and how much did the employee do to avoid the risk? So both of those situations will come into play. You know, and it's just trying to avoid, you know, in the first place, as much as you possibly and reasonably can.
Yeah, if I can maybe put a spotlight on somebody, and hopefully she won't mind. Rebecca Mooney is in the audience tonight. Rebecca, I don't know if you want to add anything into that, or if you feel, and obviously if you don't want to, that's perfectly fine. If I see you've unmuted yourself, if you want to turn your camera on so people can see you, and there you are. Hello.
Hi, how's it going?
Just explain maybe what it is you do, which is why I'm bringing you in here to this part of the conversation.
I'm a forensic engineer, and I am. My company tries to prevent accidents in the workplace rather than traditionally forensic engineers would work with insurance companies and legal teams after an accident has occurred to try and figure out what happened and give expert witness in court. I try and prevent the accidents in the first place. So yeah, absolutely. You know, this is going to be massive coming forward, the working from home piece. It's going to be, you know, there's so few companies still, I've been talking about it for years, still there's so few companies doing risk assessments in the workplace.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now I hear more and more companies are expecting people to do, when they do return to work, they're all downsizing. They're expecting 3 days in the office, 2 days at home, or whatever that flexible piece will be. A lot of hot desking going on, but your main workplace will be your at-home working desk, whatever that is, and still not getting risk assessed.
Okay, so hopefully you'll be busy. Well, hopefully busy, but you know, safe and at the same time. You know, it's kind of a bitter pill. Really.
Just to try and help employers identify what their obligations are going to be when they, you know, request that people are working from home. Just trying to stop the litigation happening. That's
prevention is better than cure, Rebecca, isn't that right?
Really, yeah.
Okay.
I've had a few clients that have adopted the hot desking, but to do it, they said, look, we'll do the hot desking, but if we do hot desking, you have to agree to a virtual risk assessment. And they sort of made a conditional and all of that. And they, you know, sort of say, otherwise we'll have you in the office, that's no problem. You know, but it's what we want to do. And people are just fine with that. They're like, okay, fine. If this is, you know, it is what it is. But yeah, but I agree. There's so many people that are just not doing the risk assessments, and they're just like, sure, that's fine. That's their own space. Like,
yeah. Hopefully it won't come back to bite them. Rebecca, thanks for joining in there, and sorry for pouncing on you like that. But it's a good opportunity for you to come and say hello to the community. Rebecca's a fellow Galway person as well. So there's a very quick question. Do co-working spaces need to do these risk assessments? Joanne, is that the question, that the facility, the provider of the co-working spaces to do these risk assessments? Is that your question?
Yes. So if people are going to start working from those co-working spaces, then where does the sense of responsibility to do the risk assessment? Is it the co-working space, or is it the employer to make sure that the co-working space is? So
the employer has the obligation on the actual workstation itself, because that's where the employee would work. And then, but in those co-working spaces, they also have to do risk assessments generally of, you know, of the building and all of that. So the way, like, your safety statement, you know, usually works is that the two interact, you know, to say, you know, this, we've done a risk assessment of this, but you also have to be aware of X's risk assessment and safety statement. So it doesn't, you can't just stop short because of, you know, the space itself has done it.
Amazing.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'm conscious of time. It's coming out to 5 too. And there was I worried, thinking, oh my God, how are we going to get the 2 hours? But I think if we had another 2 hours, we'd probably find a lot more
probably
to
still talking.
continue talking about. I don't see any more questions coming in. Blaithnaid and Lesa, thank you so much for joining and giving your time today and answering the questions and sharing your expertise. Of course, to our founding members, Ireland Together, thank you so much. I think this series that you put together is just so
Brilliant.
fantastic and practical and useful for everybody. So thank you to you guys and Morgan for coming in behind them as well. Louise, Joanne, Mindy, and Colin. I can't see you on my screens, but I know you're out there somewhere. Thank you so much for that. And for me, thank you for the opportunity to spend a bit of time with you and talking about it. I'm more than happy to ask any or answer any questions if anybody has. Questions, just give me a shout through the Ireland Together or on LinkedIn. You'll catch me hanging out there too. So that's it, guys. Does anybody want to jump in? Just like you've got a minute to jump in. Last thoughts.